Imagine standing on the deck of a warship in the vast darkness of the Pacific. The night is alive, not with silence, but with thunder. The sea trembles beneath the weight of distant gunfire. Shells streak across the sky, each carrying the will of a nation. To Captain Tamichi Hara, commanding his destroyer Amatsukaze, this was not simply combat, it was revelation. What he witnessed through those nights would stay with him long after the guns fell silent. It wasn't just about tactics or courage. It was about numbers, numbers so large that they defied imagination, and yet so small that they decided the fate of empires. Hara was a veteran long before the Pacific erupted in flame. From the attack on Pearl Harbor to the final desperate months of 1945, he served the Imperial Japanese Navy through nearly every major naval campaign. Few men saw the war's full arc the way he did, from triumph to exhaustion, from calculated strikes to sheer survival. Early in the war, he believed, like many of his peers in the spirit of decisive battle, that superior training, discipline, and courage would compensate for material shortages. Japan's naval doctrine had been built upon this belief for decades. But as the war unfolded, Hara began to see something deeper, something devastatingly clear. The enemy wasn't just the U.S. Navy. The enemy was American industry itself. He would later recall a moment during the brutal nights of Guadalcanal in late 1942. The sea near Ironbottom Sound glowed with fire as ships traded shells in close combat. Hara's destroyer danced among burning hulks, her guns straining, her crew exhausted. What stunned him most wasn't the ferocity of American sailors, it was their endless fire. He watched cruisers like the USS San Francisco unleash torrents of shells, more rounds in a minute than his ship carried for an entire mission. He noted in his log, almost in disbelief, "They are not aiming, they are filling the sky with metal." That single line captured the turning point of a global war. Japan's gunners fired deliberately, carefully measuring every round. The Americans fired without restraint, not from recklessness, but from abundance. Their magazines were deep, their supply lines bottomless. Every time a gun barrel glowed red from heat, factories thousands of miles away were already replacing the shells that had just been fired. Behind that curtain of gunfire was something few in Japan had truly grasped before the war began: the power of mass production. In 1941, the United States was still recovering from the Great Depression. Yet within months of Pearl Harbor, American factories, steel mills, shipyards, aircraft plants, and munitions depots transformed into engines of total war. Automobile assembly lines that once turned out sedans now produced tanks, bombers, and naval guns. By 1944, the United States was manufacturing more military aircraft in a single year than Japan would produce in the entire war. At Pearl Harbor, Japan had sunk or crippled 8 battleships. In response, America launched not just repairs but a revolution. By 1943, new Essex-class carriers were sliding off the docks at a pace of one every few weeks. Liberty ships, the unglamorous but vital cargo vessels, were being built faster than German submarines could sink them. Entire convoys left the West Coast every few days, laden with ammunition, food, fuel, and spare parts. Every bullet that Hara's men counted carefully was matched by 1,000 rolling off an American conveyor belt. In contrast, Japan's industry remained bound by limits of geography and resources. It had the skill and ingenuity, but not the scale. Its shipyards could produce fine vessels, but too few. Its aircraft were sleek and agile, but the factories that made them were vulnerable to shortages of aluminum and fuel. Its ammunition depots could not keep up with the pace of modern war. Japan's leaders believed that spirit and precision could triumph over mass, that one superior ship or one well-trained pilot could overcome 10 of the enemy. At Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal, that belief was tested and found wanting. Back in Tokyo, naval planners wrestled with impossible numbers. They calculated how many shells could be spared for each gun before fuel convoys would have to be cut. Some destroyers were allocated as little as 12 rounds per barrel for an entire sortie. 12 shots, then silence. Hara understood what that meant. The outcome of battles was being decided not by bravery, but by mathematics. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, even before Guadalcanal, Japanese officers began noticing the signs. Commander Teshima Nadido aboard the carrier Shikaku was astonished by the way American escort ships maintained continuous anti-aircraft fire for hours. "They never stopped," he wrote later. "They seemed to have no fear of running out." Each American destroyer appeared to carry more anti-aircraft ammunition than an entire Japanese division. At first, it seemed absurd. But as the war went on, it became undeniable. Japanese doctrine restricted gunners to strict firing protocols. Anti-aircraft crews were trained to wait until the enemy was within 800 meters, fire short bursts, conserve every shell. Not because it was tactically perfect, but because it was all they could afford. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, serving aboard the carrier Ryujo, calculated that his ship could sustain 12 minutes of continuous fire before its magazines were empty. 12 minutes. When he compared this to the endless barrage from American ships, he realized the gap was more than tactical, it was existential. Everywhere Hara fought, he saw this truth reinforced. During the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, the combined Allied fleet fired over 11,000 heavy shells, scoring only a handful of hits. The Japanese gunnery was far superior that night, and the Allies suffered a crushing defeat. Yet even in victory, Hara sensed something ominous. The Allied ships never seemed to hesitate. They kept firing as though their magazines were infinite. His ship Amatsukaze used nearly half its ammunition in that single battle. Had the fight lasted longer, they would have been helpless. The Allies lost ships that night, but America could replace them. Japan could not. This imbalance was not born on the battlefield. It was created in places far from the front, in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Seattle, and San Francisco. American workers, men and women alike, labored around the clock in factories that never slept. Women built bombers, welders stitched together submarines, and engineers perfected the science of efficiency. The war effort became a machine of staggering coordination. Railroads delivered coal and steel to foundries. Foundries poured molten metal into molds for tank parts and ship plating. Truck convoys and merchant fleets distributed everything to every corner of the Pacific. It wasn't just production. It was synchronization on a scale humanity had never seen. Japan tried desperately to match it. The government pushed for increased armaments, mobilized students, converted civilian factories into weapons plants. But the empire lacked oil, steel, and even copper. By 1944, aircraft were being built from wood and training fuel was rationed so heavily that pilots graduated with barely a few hours of flight time. Destroyers like Hara's were forced to reuse shell casings and salvage fragments from unexploded ordnance. The very weapons of war were being recycled to sustain another day of fighting. Meanwhile, the United States was producing abundance beyond measure. In 1944 alone, America manufactured more than 24,000 aircraft, 8,000 tanks, and millions of tons of ammunition. The industrial output of the continental U.S. exceeded that of all Axis powers combined. Behind every American sailor stood not just his ship, but a continent of machines, workers, and resources. By the time Hara fought his last battles in 1945, he no longer believed in decisive engagements. The war had become a slow drowning, an industrial tide that no amount of courage could resist. He wrote later, with quiet sorrow, that Japan had gone to war with a sword against a factory. Every night battle, every torpedo run, every act of heroism was weighed against the relentless arithmetic of production. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, and the empire lay in ruins, Hara survived, one of the few senior destroyer captains to do so. He walked through the ashes of Tokyo and understood that Japan had been defeated long before Hiroshima. It was defeated the moment it underestimated the power of the assembly line, the warehouse, the shipyard. The war had proven that modern conflict was not won solely by bravery, but by the ability to replace what was lost faster than the enemy could destroy it. In the years that followed, Hara wrote his memoirs not with bitterness, but with reflection. He admired the discipline of American sailors, but more than that, he respected the invisible army behind them, the millions who forged the weapons and supplies that sustained them. For him, that realization was both humbling and haunting. He had seen the old world of naval honor collide with the new reality of mechanized warfare. It was, he said, a war where courage was measured not in heart but in horsepower. Today, when historians study the Pacific War, they often focus on the great battles Midway, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa. But beneath every clash lay the same truth Hara had seen in the glare of tracer fire. That industry, not strategy, would decide the future. The Battle of Midway may have changed momentum, but it was the American factory that sealed Japan's fate. Each rivet driven, each shell produced, each ship launched, all were part of the same unstoppable current. Captain Tamichi Hara's story is more than that of a naval officer. It's the story of realization, of watching the world shift beneath your feet and knowing there is nothing you can do to stop it. His words still echo as a warning and a lesson. No nation, however brave, can fight a war it cannot afford to supply. As dawn rose over the quiet Pacific, years after the war ended, the same waters that once blazed with gunfire now reflected only light and silence. The factories that had once roared with production turned back to peace. And somewhere in that calm, perhaps Hara finally understood that the true victory of the war was not just the defeat of one side, but the awakening of all humanity to the sheer cost of industrial conflict. The sound of guns fades, but the echoes of industry remain, the measure of firepower written not in shells, but in the engines that built them.